As a scientist working on the search for life in the universe, one of the most common comments I see in this channel relates to UFOs, now often rebranded as UAPs. In the last few years, the interest in UFOs has only risen thanks to some surprising revelations from parts of the US government, as well as numerous ex-government personnel coming forward. I felt like this topic was important to discuss on here in the spirit of transparent dialogue, because when we don't talk about it, conspiracies and misinformation have a tendency to fill the vacuum. So, what do astronomers such as myself, who search for life in the universe, actually think about the recent flurry of news stories? Let's start with clearing the air a bit here. I think there is a widespread perception that scientists are unwilling to discuss this topic at all, as if they consider the idea of alien visitation to be fundamentally non-scientific or even the subject of ridicule. But I don't think that's true. In all of my interactions with my colleagues, I found them to be open-minded, thoughtful, and engaged. A good example of this was in a recent Scientific American article published by SETI scientists Ravi Kopparapu and Jacob Hack-Misra, who correctly point out that if we consider aliens on exoplanets to be within the realm of science, then aliens in space or even in our atmosphere must equally be so. There's no magical distance from the Earth at which suddenly something stops becoming science. So let's just first dispel the idea that scientists consider this topic to be somehow off limits as a matter of principle. Okay, fine, but there is a difference between principles and practicalities. In a real-world sense, how can science ingest claims like UFOs? This is frankly a very challenging case study for the scientific method because, put bluntly, the reliability of the claimed evidence is itself uncertain. Now, it has to be said that that is a highly unusual situation for researchers to be faced with, so perhaps a good starting point for this video is just to walk through how science normally would proceed. Let's take astronomy as our example. We typically start with some interesting hypothesis and then we go to the telescope to collect observations to test it or compare to archival observations. That's the first distinguishing characteristic of science. Hypotheses are not accepted unless supporting evidence can be provided, which necessarily means that said hypotheses must be actually testable. Next, we analyze the data using transparent and reproducible methodologies, allowing us to test hypotheses using the data and then report our findings as well as typically the raw data itself. Now, a second characteristic of a modern scientific claim is that it is usually attached to some statistical evaluations of the confidence and uncertainty. A pair of especially important numbers are the true positive rate, which is how often we'd correctly identify the phenomenon of interest via injection recovery tests, and the false positive rate, how often we'd erroneously claim the phenomenon in control data where it absolutely does not exist. Keep those in mind for what follows. After this, the paper is reviewed by peers, as in other reputable astronomers with relevant expertise, to check for any obvious major flaws in the arguments being made. This is the third characteristic of modern science, peer review, to solicit experts to skeptically interrogate these scientific claims. Look, nobody's perfect, everybody makes mistakes, and so having some checks and balances is crucial. Next, if the claim is of sufficiently high interest to the scientific community, or even the wider public, then another team will inevitably want to skeptically interrogate the claim, and so they will produce their own independent analysis. Now, that could be using the same data as the original team, or often by collecting independent data to verify or reject the claim. So the fourth characteristic of modern science is a higher level of peer review performed by the broader community. Now, if a hypothesis survives its entire process intact, then it becomes provisionally accepted. But of course, all hypotheses are up for grabs. Even decades later, they are still being skeptically interrogated. So in this framework, an accepted scientific claim is one that has passed intense scrutiny where both the methods and data are made public and multiple independent supporting evidences have been provided by multiple independent sources. You know, making data public is great for evaluating scientific claims, but it has to be said there is some data that we don't want to be public, and that's our personal data. Fortunately, that is where the sponsor of today's video can help, Incogni.com. I truly despise having to give out my personal information online, and so, like many of us, I've developed these defensive mechanisms, like using a VPN, pseudonyms, and janky old Yahoo email addresses from years ago, whenever possible. But the thing is, no matter how careful you are, there are data brokers out there who are harvesting and selling your personal information to the highest bidder. I don't know about you, but that drives me nuts. And of course, as time goes on, the situation just gets worse and worse as this information proliferates online. So that's why I started using Incogni.com. Rather than just being on the defense all the time, it goes on the offense for you. Their team scour data brokers for your records and then legally request your records to be deleted on your behalf. And they keep at it over and over again until your information is gone, taking the fight to them. So if you want to fight back against this crap, Incogni have partnered with us to offer you an incredible deal of a massive 60% off using the link incogni.com/coolworlds. Link down below in the description. I am personally resting easier using this product, and I am only endorsing products which I think are genuinely worth it. So please do check out incogni.com/coolworlds today. Okay, back to the video. With our Science 101 complete, let's now direct the machinery of science to the question of UAPs. The problem here is that essentially all of the presented evidence thus far falls outside of the norms of scientific analyses. To see this, let's consider 3 prominent examples that have been highlighted in the news over the last few years. First, we have the US Navy videos released by the Pentagon showing 3 objects that the US Navy were unable to identify, and hence the label UAP. Second, we have personal testimony of several pilots, perhaps most famously David Fravor, detailing accounts with phenomena that they were also unable to identify. And third, we have the recent bombshell claim by ex-intelligence officer David Grush that the US government is in possession of something like a dozen alien spaceships. This is not an exhaustive list, but arguably captures the 3 most news-grabbing cases. Now, I'm not going to discuss these claims in detail. If you want that, there are plenty of breakdown videos on YouTube that dissect these. Instead, I'm just going to discuss how these claims might get ingested into the scientific framework, which is really the point of this video. For our purposes, the relevant fact is that amongst these 3 cases, only one of them is actually accompanied with released data that we could at least plausibly integrate in a scientific framework. I'm not going to lie, the 3 Pentagon videos really grabbed my attention when I first saw them. Here we have seemingly legitimate UAP data from a credible source. But of course, the immediate question is whether these could simply be something fairly mundane, like a balloon, a bird, or a distant aircraft, for example. Taking these videos in isolation, there are at least plausible, if somewhat improbable, alternative explanations that do not involve alien spacecraft. Look, given enough hours of recording, unlikely events can and will sometimes be recorded on film. I mean, anybody on YouTube knows that. I did an interview with Mick West a few years back who is able to explain and reproduce what we see in the Pentagon videos without aliens, and I think you should check that out to make up your own mind. The poor quality video, brief nature of the clips, and lack of public auxiliary data like radar makes these frustratingly ambiguous. This isn't to say that the data are definitively not showing alien spacecraft in motion. That could possibly be, but the current evidence presented is insufficient to conclusively determine that. Nobody is happy with ambiguity. Scientists in particular despise it, but without a full data dump of all of the video archives, the GPS information, the associated radar data, the software used to record those videos, and indeed much more, we are unfortunately stuck here. A frequent comment by UFO proponents at this juncture is that the Pentagon videos aren't the be-all and end-all. There is also the personal testimonies of the pilots themselves. And indeed, by extension, the recent claims by David Grush also fall into the category of personal testimony. And this is where it gets really tricky for science to proceed. First, I want to acknowledge that what makes these testimonies interesting is the fact that they come from ostensibly credible sources. Fravor is a highly trained military pilot, and Grush is an ex-government intelligence officer, both with many years of well-respected service behind them. And of course, there's also other sources, some anonymous and some not, who have also provided supporting testimonies to these accounts, such as other pilots, observers, radar operators, and government whistleblowers. But regardless, the evidence being discussed here is still personal accounts, word of mouth. A challenge in discussing this openly is that some might have a hostile, knee-jerk reaction to any skepticism of these testimonies. The implication is that any skepticism of these accounts translates to insinuations that these individuals are lying, delusional, or even incompetent. To this, I would simply say that we cannot engage in scientific discourse if the presented evidence is somehow immune from skeptical interrogation. That is at the very core of how science works. This is not motivated by some desire for character assassination of these individuals, but rather it is a foundational component to the very act of scientific inquiry. If claims cannot be questioned, then we are not doing science. It resembles something more like religious dogma at that point. And I don't think that anybody involved truly wants that if they seriously think about it. So yes, we have to be willing to unapologetically, skeptically question the claims, or else there's simply no path forward within the scientific framework. Once we concede that, what we're really admitting is that in scientific parlance, there is a non-zero false positive rate. So that means that there must exist some instances of erroneously reported UAPs due to some kind of misidentification of a natural or simply mundane phenomenon. Take the case of a pilot reporting a UAP as a toy example. Amongst the US military branches, there are approximately 28,000 trained pilots, with pilots typically flying something like 200 hours per year outside of deployment. So put together, that is 5.6 million hours per year. Please don't get too hung up on the numbers here, we are just ballparking as a pedagogical example. Now, let's assume that military pilots are incredibly reliable observers, such that the rate of their misidentifications leading to erroneous UAP reports equates to one case in every 10,000 hours flown. Doing the math, that would give us about 560 false reports each year, which is actually fairly close to the 742 UFOs reported per year in the famous Project Blue Book report on UFOs by the US Air Force. Now consider that a further vetting stage is applied by government investigators that are able to remove 95% of these as having a clear natural explanation. Again, that's a number that's similar to Project Blue Book, as well as the recent NASA UAP Task Force investigation. Applying a 95% cut drops us down to about 28 anomalous things per year. So these are events flagged as a UAP by both a trained pilot and subsequent investigators. And yet, despite that, they are all, in fact, by definition, natural or mundane phenomena in this hypothetical scenario. Finally, the incident reported by David Fravor occurred almost 2 decades ago, so over that time, we'd expect roughly 500 spurious events like this. So these example numbers show how it is quite possible for even highly trained military pilots with a remarkably low misidentification rate to still produce hundreds of erroneous UAP reports over the years, events which have even survived independent scrutiny afterwards. What I hope this exercise illustrates more than anything is how crucial the false positive rate is. I assumed 0.01% in that scenario, but if it were 0.1%, then there'd be 10 times more spurious events than this. To have scientific evidence then of a real UAP population, we would have to detect more UAPs than that expected from pure false positives. If instead we found it was a similar amount, then we would conclude that it is perfectly consistent with simple misidentifications combined with large number statistics. Like monkeys on a typewriter, with millions of hours of variations and combinations, there will inevitably be some compelling prose randomly regurgitated. It's simply a numbers game. Now, of course, the whole problem is that when it comes to personal testimony, it is extremely difficult to accurately quantify the false positive rate of these eyewitness accounts. I assumed 0.01%, but really that's a complete guess. And of course, this gets even harder when one considers variability between individuals as well as the possible presence of bad actors in the mix. Now, having multiple independent observers would surely decrease the false positive rate. Yes, I agree, no doubt. But crucially, that is merely a qualitative statement. We actually need to quantify these rates in order to make progress here. Yet more, the rate is surely temporally and spatially variable as the number of drones and balloons flying each year continues to rise, complicating things even more. As I hope is becoming clear, this whole situation is very different from that with astronomical observations, where usually we can observe a control set, some artificial stars, or test our algorithms on simulated control cases, any of which would allow us to reliably measure the false positive rate. In principle, one could do this for pilots and maybe even ex-intelligence officers, but in practice, this is extremely difficult to implement, and without it, we're essentially stuck. It's not that the topic itself is inherently non-scientific, but rather that the tools of science simply cannot make progress in the described scenario. On top of this, there's another huge problem here, and that's interpretation. As I'm sure you well know, the U in UFO or UAP doesn't mean aliens, it simply means unidentified. Even if you could calculate a false positive rate, a true positive rate, and show that there exists a statistically significant population of UAPs, all you have done is establish that something exists that cannot be explained by current knowledge. And that something could trivially be some previously unknown but non-alien phenomenon. I think this possibility is being casually dismissed by many UFO proponents who too easily jump to aliens to explain such reports. But to astronomers, we are intimately familiar with the folly of claiming aliens when you encounter something that you've simply never seen before. Not a god of the gaps, but an alien of the gaps. Percival Lowell was convinced that streaks on Mars were alien canals. The first pulsar discovered was playfully called Little Green Man 1, and many considered Boyagin's star must be an alien megastructure when first discovered. But in each case, of course, there were no aliens. They were simply new natural phenomenon. If history teaches us nothing else, it's that we should not be so arrogant to assume that we understand nature in her totality. She constantly surprises us and reveals how limited our knowledge truly is. So, in my interpretation of the scientific method, the unknown and possibly unquantifiable false positive rate of these claims, coupled with the ambiguity in their interpretation, makes them at present simply too uncertain to make any substantive conclusions about. Again, just to emphasize, this doesn't mean that it is not aliens, but the reliability and reproducibility of the available methods and data is far from the norms that we would expect for even fairly frankly low-stakes mundane scientific claims, let alone aliens. I sincerely hope this situation does change though. I would love to see a complete video archive, releases of the software used behind these videos, studies quantifying the pilot false positive rates, and just in general more transparency on these topics. And I think that is happening, which is great. But for me, I'm going to need to see a lot higher quality data than that which we have seen thus far in order to establish a convincing case for alien visitation. But enough of my thoughts. What do my colleagues think? How do other astronomers and more broadly the SETI community think about this, which, to be clear, includes many interdisciplinary fields? Recently, Marissa Yingling published a survey of 1,460 faculty across 144 major research universities exploring academic views on UAPs. Concerning the Pentagon videos, over half of those surveyed expressed that their primary reaction was curiosity. Almost 20% said skeptical, another roughly 20% were indifferent, and the remaining were either confused, excited, or something else. Asked whether the release increased the credibility of UAPs, 30% reported not at all, another 30% said slightly, 20% said moderately, with the rest saying significantly or greatly. From this survey, one of the more surprising results is that of those who responded, 18.9% said that they or someone close to them had seen something unexplained, which matched the description of a UAP. So, taken at face value, this report supports the notion that a lot of academics are following the UAP stories with interest. There's not some unified front of ridicule or scorn. On the other hand, there are plenty of selection effects to think about here. For one, only 3.9% of those emailed actually completed the survey, which is obviously a very low participation rate. An obvious concern here is that those who already believe in UAPs beforehand are more likely to respond to this survey, thus biasing these numbers. For a point of record, although over 40,000 faculty were asked to participate in this survey, I certainly did not participate, nor do I ever recall seeing this email in my inbox. It should also be noted that scientists make up only a minority of those surveyed. Less than a quarter of those who responded come from physics, astronomy, biology, chemistry, or related fields. It's unclear whether the remainder have scientific training. So these results are useful for understanding how some self-selecting fraction of US academics think about UAPs, but it doesn't really answer the question posed in this video: how do scientists think about it? So I conducted my own little informal survey of some colleagues working in the field of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. To me, this is surely the most relevant group, given that they should a priori have thought about this the most deeply given their field of concentration. Now, obviously, my survey should be taken with a huge grain of salt because it hasn't gone through peer review or followed rigorous standards of polling. I simply wanted to ask colleagues I know and trust, including many leaders in the field, what do they think about this? I got a response from everyone I emailed, and only one declined to answer the survey, leaving me with 10 completed surveys. So keep in mind, this is small number statistics. But I will say that although I'm going to keep the names of my participants anonymous, these are the people in the field right now dominating the scientific discourse, so just keep that in mind. I asked them 3 questions. First, should astronomers study UAPs? Are they a part of SETI? 3 said yes, 1 said they were indifferent, 4 said no, and 2 said in principle yes, but in practice no. For that last category, the sentiment was that there's no reason why UAPs couldn't be a part of science one day, it's just that the existing data is sadly inadequate. Next, I asked them how scientifically interesting are UAPs from a scale of 0 to 10. The results are pretty polarized here. 7 said 2 or less, but 2 participants said 8 or higher, and 1 felt unsure. So overall, definitely a bit more negative on this question. I think most were okay with some small fraction of effort being spent on this question, but in a relative sense, it's a rather low priority compared to other approaches. In question 3, I asked them what their reaction was to the Pentagon videos, mirroring the question that Yingling asked in her survey. 8 of the 10 SETI scientists said that they were unconvinced by them, saying such things as that they were likely man-made, military vehicles, or just simply not aliens. I will note some nuance here that one of them said that their initial reaction was shock, but then after watching Mick West's videos, they became less convinced. And a second said that although they were initially unconvinced, after speaking to the pilots directly, they became more intrigued. Of the remaining 2 SETI scientists, 1 said they were puzzled and another said they hadn't seen them at all. As you can see then, there's a diverse range of views and opinions here, but broadly, I think there is an open-mindedness about the idea of studying UAPs, but at the same time, a consensus that the current data is not currently convincing, which I think mirrors my comments made earlier in this video. As we all know, there are new stories running on UAPs on an almost weekly basis at this point, so my opinion may certainly change if new evidence comes in. And you know what? That's how science should be. we don't make definitive judgments until the evidence is conclusive, and we change our minds guided by new information. But speaking for myself, I'm going to need to see reliable data with quantifiable false positive rates, reproducible methodologies, and archival data sources to be moved here, which is the same way that I would treat any scientific claim. So, although I'm skeptical for now, I'm open-minded, and hey, I think this would genuinely be the most exciting discovery we could ever make, so let's keep our eyes open. I do think UAPs bring into focus fundamental questions about how we interpret evidence in an unbiased and consistent manner. In fact, over the last few months, I've been working on a new paper to try and develop such a unified framework that could treat everything from fossils on Mars to radio SETI, from UAPs to biosignatures. And on top of that, we have projects in my team looking for engineered stars and alien artifacts on the moon, so please no one accuse us of not being interested in this question. But I will say that the stigma of alien hunting is real, and this kind of work is incredibly difficult to fund, which is why I am so grateful to supporters to my research team, the Cool Worlds Lab, who allow us to pursue this kind of challenging work. So let me just take a quick moment to thank our latest two supporters, that is Patrick Muzikia and Alfonso Harrison, who have pledged and are making this happen. As always, if you have the resources to spare and think we are worth it and want to help out our research team, then please consider making a tax-deductible gift by checking out the link in the description. To finish, I'm going to play us out with a few interviews I did with some colleagues at a recent SETI conference held at Penn State just a few weeks back, so you can hear from them directly about this topic. Please do let me know down below in the comments, what do you think? Where do you land on this discussion? And as always, thank you so much for watching, stay thoughtful and stay curious.
Adam Frank, University of Rochester, Professor of Astrophysics. I'm all for an open, agnostic search for, or investigation of UAPs. I don't think they have anything to do with life on other planets because we've never seen any evidence that would point to that extraordinary conclusion.
Hi, I'm Dawn Gelino. I'm the Deputy Director of the NASA Exoplanet Science Institute.
Dawn, what do you think of UAPs? Are they scientifically interesting and are you studying them?
I do think they're potentially scientifically interesting, although we don't have a lot of scientific data on them. We have hearsay and people's personal accounts.
I'm Anna Maria Berea. I'm an associate professor at George Mason University. I think they are amazingly scientifically interesting, not because they are related to aliens or extraterrestrial life, but mostly because it's something we don't know what they are about, and as scientists we want to find out if it's an interesting atmospheric phenomenon, if these are about cognitive biases or what they are. So yeah, it's very interesting to find something new in science.